Bom dia a todos. Antes de começar esse seminário, eu tenho alguns recados a dar, especialmente porque este evento ele está sendo gravado, né? Transmitido ao vivo e gravado. Então, as perguntas sempre devem ser feitas ao microfone. E eu peço para que vocês se identifiquem, somos poucos, então é fácil aqui a gente se identificar. Peço também para que vocês coloquem os celulares no modo silencioso, por favor. Para o público online, as perguntas podem ser enviadas para o e-mail iearesponde@usp.br. O vídeo e as fotos estarão disponíveis na mediateca do IEA ou no canal do YouTube dentro de 10 dias úteis. And now we start to speak in English. So welcome to our seminar, The Contribution of Living Labs to Urban Sustainability Transitions, How to Deal with Scaling Up. I'm Gabriela Di Giulio, Professor at Environmental Health Department, School of Public Health at University of São Paulo. It's a great pleasure to be here and to have all of you here. And welcome to the public who watches our seminar through the broadcast online. So before the introduction of our speakers, I'd like to express my gratitude to Sandra Sedini from IEA, who helped us to organize and disseminate this event. This seminar is co-organized by the School of Public Health, where I am, the Research Group Environment and Society from IEA, the GLOCOO project, which is funded by Belmont Fórum and FAPESP, and has the support of the program PRIN to USP CAPS and for postgrad programs from USP. I'd like to express my gratitude to Michele and Fabiano, who works with me and our research team at School of Public Health, and many thanks for you, for your help, for your support. So it's a big honor and a huge responsibility to moderate this seminar. I have the pleasure to introduce you Professor Joop de Kraker from International Center for Integrated Assessment Sustainable Development, Maastricht University, Netherlands, and Professor Pedro Jacobi, who heads the Research Group Environment and Society. Professor de Kraker has a regional background in agroecological system analysis, modeling, and decision support. His studies focus on participatory assessment tools, transdisciplinarity, co-production of knowledge. He's principal investigator and supervisor of several research projects on sustainable urban development and urban living labs, including the GLOCOO project. Professor Jacobi is social scientist with a PhD in sociology. He's full professor at the graduate program in environmental science at USP. His studies are focused on environmental governance, and he's the principal investigator of the research project Environmental Governance of the Macro Metropolis of São Paulo, MacroAmb, funded by FAPESP. So in this morning, Joop has around 40-45 minutes to talk about the challenges and opportunities related to transitions to sustainability. So his speech focuses on the current debate of urban living labs. And in his speech, he called our attention to the need to scale up the innovation developed in urban living labs from the experimental to mainstream. And Professor Jacobi focused his talk on the challenges and opportunities to transition to sustainability, paying special attention to the context of Global South, particularly to the context of Brazil. So based on his empirical studies and analysis, Professor Jacobi called our attention to some important dimensions that affect the ability of governments and society to advance in sustainability and to the challenge of transdisciplinarity. So many thanks again for both of you. And Professor Joop, it's yours.
Okay, thank you, Gabriela, for the nice introduction and for having me here. As you see on the first slide, my talk will be rather abstract, not with the nice picture that you saw on the slide before of the agricultural system. Actually, I prefer to see those nice pictures because my background is in agriculture. So whenever I see such a picture, I think, oh wow, I should be in the field. And anyway, urban living labs, sustainability transitions are also a fascinating topic. I've been working on for the past 4 or 5 years, and I'll share you some of the insights that I developed during those years. So as the title, rather long title of my talk indicates, I will be talking about sustainability transitions, about the role of urban living labs in those transitions, and particularly focus on the issue of upscaling from experiment to mainstream. Well, Gabriella already told a bit about my background. I started out as an ecologist, focusing on production systems, agriculture production systems, at Wageningen University, where I also obtained my PhD, and I worked for quite a while also as a postdoc in, actually employed by Wageningen, but working in South America, Africa, and Asia most of the time. Since 2001, I'm employed by the Open University in the Netherlands, which is a distance teaching university. I still have a position there as Associate Professor of Environmental Sciences. And since 2013, I'm also employed by Maastricht University and currently as full Professor of Sustainability Assessment. A little bit about Maastricht University. It's the most international university in the Netherlands. We have a graduate here in the audience from Maastricht University. And she can tell you that whereas we have 40% of our students, or more than 50 from abroad, 30% actually are from Germany. So to put it a bit into perspective, we're located at the border of the Netherlands, Belgium and Germany, so that's why we have a lot of Belgian and German students, but also from other parts of the world, including quite a lot from Brazil as well. So very international university, and also the center that I'm working is an international center with a very international group of PhD students and master students as well, focusing on sustainability science in connection to policy and society. It has a very long name, pronounced quite correctly by Gabriella, but it's quite a challenge always, and so we usually use the abbreviation ISIS, which has nowadays a bit negative connotations as well. And people also forget what it stands for. So very soon our official name will be Maastricht Sustainability Institute. Okay, so that's something you can probably remember. Okay, so ISIS, as it's still called, is about, we celebrate our 20-year anniversary last year, so it's 21-year-old now, so it's mature by now. It was founded by Jan Rotmans, and both Jan and René Kemp and Dirk Loorbach have worked, and René Kemp is still working at ISIS, and are sort of founders of thinking about sustainability transitions and how to manage those. So both the theory of socio-technical transitions and ways to manage such transitions as expressed in strategic niche management and transition management originate at ISIS actually. When I arrived at ISIS, I brought another dimension with me, which is the study of social learning, multi-actor learning for sustainable development. So how do a very diverse group of actors together produce knowledge to address sustainability issues, and how can you support such a group with certain support tools? combining that with the expertise that was already present at ICES, we came to a new research focus, urban living labs, and also a new approach how to study these through transdisciplinary action research. And I'll talk more about these topics in the rest of my presentation. It turned out to be a very productive avenue for further research, urban living labs. So you see here the logos of some completed and quite a lot of ongoing research projects still, which all focus on urban living labs. So UrbanX, Smarter Labs, and Glocal are international projects funded by Europe and Belmont Forum. Particularly Glocal is worldwide in terms of international. The others were European. And the other 4 projects mentioned there are national projects, so smaller, focusing on Dutch networks of living labs. I'll present some of the results from most of these projects in the course of my talk. So first, the concept of socio-technical or sustainability transitions. So how does such a major transition in society come about? That's a topic that has fascinated scholars already for quite a long time. And one of the most known theories about how transitions come about is the so-called multi-level perspective, developed by Geels and Kemp and others. Which it's called multi-level because it distinguishes 3 basic levels in society and theorizes that transitions move from niches to regimes under the influence of the landscape. And these are quite abstract terms. Niches are sort of protected spaces where innovations take place, where experiments are done with new ways of meeting human needs. That can be technical, that can be institutional, that can be social type of innovations. And an accumulation of such innovations can start to interact with the current regime, which is the sort of current constellations of how we produce, how we consume, how we organize things. And the regimes are determined by the landscape. The landscape is about the more deep-rooted structures of society. For example, in legal terms, you can think of the Constitution, but also deep embedded cultural values. Those change at a much slower pace than regimes change, and they also determine in the end whether a regime shift can take place or not. This is a more detailed representation of how such a transition can take place. So in the niches, all kinds of innovations take place. Many of those fail, they will never make it, or they will remain and survive in the niche. But some, for a variety of factors, may scale up, may develop, may become much wider implemented, and start to change the current incumbent socio-technical regime, which is made up of infrastructure, markets, technology, etc. And these all may, in a stepwise fashion, change, and then one regime may be sort of succeeded by a new one. And of course, the regimes and the landscape interact also at the same time. So in a way, it looks complicated, but essentially it's a rather simple representation of how transitions can take place in society. And of course, reality is quite complex and much more variable, but this multi-level perspective gives a good handle on studying transitions. And of course, then the conclusion is always, well, it's a bit more complex than this simple theory represents. But it gives a good perspective, a good lens on studying transitions. So what I will focus now on is particularly this move of innovations from niche to regime, from experimental to mainstream. So this move from niche to regime is what I call here upscaling. Upscaling has many meanings, but I use it here for this development from an innovation or set of innovations from the niche level to the mainstream, to the regime. And both transition management and strategic niche management are sort of theories, but also with their practical versions on how to manage such development from niche to regime. And well, they're quite elaborate, but to summarize, transition management focuses more on the regime level. That says, well, we have to develop a new vision of how a sustainable regime would look like, how we want the regime to be, to make it sustainable. And that vision then can guide the experimentation and the innovation in the niches. Strategic niche management starts more from the bottom up, that says, well, for these experiments and innovations to take place and to be able to arrive at more sustainable innovations and sustainable technology, we have to pay attention to creating these niches and make it fruitful places for innovation. And then when you have a lot of these innovations, then they will scale up and affect a regime. So two different ways of looking at scaling up. Okay, then the next major concept is that of the urban living labs. And what we do in our work on urban living labs is to conceive urban living labs as typically niches. So urban living labs are niches in society where experimentation can take place, where innovations can be developed that in the longer run, by scaling up, can change the regime from unsustainable to more sustainable regime. The background of urban living labs is in innovation already quite a while. There's been attention for real-life testing of innovations before bringing them to the market, particularly in IT innovation. User involvement is already taking place for a while with beta versions that are developed then into a marketable version of technology, IT technology, with the help of users. Another important concept in innovation, which is included in urban living labs, is that of open innovation. So it's not just one company or one research group working on an innovation, but the process of innovation is made open to a variety of other actors that then bring in new perspective, new knowledge and expertise, and the combination of this diversity of expertise then results in new innovations. Another development is that cities has stepped to the forefront in sustainable development and saying, we here experience the problems on the ground of climate change and the need of adaptation, the need to do something about climate change, renewable energy, waste management, circular economy. Those are all issues that cities are faced with, and cities have more and more sort of seen themselves as being important initiators also in trying to solve these problems. And that combination of developments is basically at the root of urban living labs. If you look at the characteristics of this diversity that you see in practice of urban living labs all around the world, then you see a set of shared characteristics with a very much problem-oriented type of innovation. The innovation is not just to increase market share or earn a lot of money, but it's really to solve current and pressing problems. It's developing these innovations in real-life contexts, so not in an isolated setting. It follows an iterative approach, so it's not that it's a straight line from ID to realization of an innovation, but it's a first prototype, it's tested, you learn from the experiences, you adapt it, etc. So it's a stepwise process in innovation. Co-creation is an important concept, so it goes back to the idea of open innovation, so involve a variety of actors, people from municipality, from research, from companies, but also quite importantly citizens. And that brings me to the last characteristic. This co-creation is achieved by participation of a diversity of actors. A nice example of an urban living lab is that of the city of Antwerp, the second largest city of Belgium and also the second largest port of Europe, where couple of, I think 4 years ago, Stadslab Antwerpen 2050, so Urban Lab 2050 was developed. 2050 is the year that Antwerp aims to be a sustainable city. And so this Urban Lab is really focusing on how can we transform the city of Antwerp to a sustainable city by 2050. And the slogan is wij experimenteren een toekomst, which translates to we experiment ourselves a future. Yeah? So the idea is very strongly that to develop into a sustainable city, we have to learn how to do this. We have to learn it by experimenting, by testing new ideas, and in a stepwise way, we will sort of find out how Antwerp can become sustainable. They have 5 key themes: circularity, energy, climate adaptation, air quality, and mobility. Those are the themes, and within these themes they do a lot of experiments, activities, projects, etc. And the 6th one is a more open project fund for any good ideas that citizens have that can be funded through that fund. So Antwerp has been an important partner in several projects, like the UrbanExp project, which was not only in Antwerp but also in Malmö in Sweden and Graz and another city in Austria, where we learned about urban living labs. What kind of problems are they suited for, how to organize them, how can they be integrated in the larger infrastructure of a city, through setting up living labs. So it's a form of action research. So together with municipalities and other actors in the city, we set up these labs and learned by doing how to do it. So that resulted in a booklet with guidelines for urban labs, how to organize them, how to set them up, how to run them, and also a lab kit, which I brought with me, and I'll hand over also to Gabriella. Just to say here, so it's a very practical tool. Laying an urban lab in a day is the slogan. So it's a kit with guiding questions and answers, helping a group of actors to think about, okay, what do we want, how can we organize it if we want an urban living lab, what to focus on, etc. So this action research is not only generating more scientific insights, but also is meant to generate very practical tools also to help move urban living labs forward. One of the lessons that we learned from this UrbanExp project was about learning. Learning is emphasized a lot in urban living labs, but we found that it's not so easy to organize it. So two major lessons were you don't need to involve all the participants in learning all the time. And also that brings along a need to structure the learning process a lot because different actors have different learning agendas, also depending on the activities they're involved in. So if you structure that in that way, then it's much more easy to sort of take everyone with you in the learning process, but not at the same time. So in a smaller project that we do together with the Urban Lab of Antwerp, we developed a learning support tool which guides the learning at the different levels they have in their lab, at the experiment level, more at the theme level, so when it's about, let's say, climate adaptation as a theme, and the different theme, the lessons learned in the different themes together bring the lessons at the lab level, where it has implications on actually the policy and the implementation of policy of the municipality. Okay, so another issue that came out of this first project was the issue of embedding of the lessons, embedding of the innovations from labs, and scaling them up, wider implementation within cities, across cities of the innovations. So what we noticed, both from our own experiences and from that of others, is that you have a lot of urban living labs nowadays, but it's not that we can see major impacts on sustainability transitions. It's not that Antwerp has turned into a sustainable city overnight. Of course, we realize that it takes time, but we also realize that it takes very targeted efforts to have impact from urban living labs. So for that reason, we started a couple of research projects focusing on a variety of aspects of upscaling from urban living labs. And we again did that in an action research type of way. So we developed ideas on how upscaling could be stimulated, and we implemented those. And then by doing that, we learned both more about the process of upscaling as a sort of scientific understanding of this process of upscaling. And also we developed know-how on how to stimulate upscaling in urban living labs. So this upscaling process is typically represented by this S-shaped curve. This is a picture from a publication of Jan Rotmans, who distinguished 4 phases in this upscaling process that suggests that we basically have a good understanding of upscaling, but actually these are just names of different parts of the curves. Actually, we know very little what happens behind these labels. What are the factors determining it's to occur or not to occur? Okay, the first project that we explicitly used to address upscaling is the Smarter Labs project, where we said, well, if we want upscaling to happen of innovations from an urban living lab, we should already anticipate possible constraints at the regime level to innovations, not after we have developed the innovation, but when we develop the innovation, so that we already shape the innovation in such a way that constraints at the regime level can be tackled. So we developed a methodology on identifying constraints, addressing those, making those part of designing the experiments, and then trying to implement those. Okay. That's where we... So one of the outcomes was this nice Sorry, this is another one. Not mine. Okay. Oh, okay.
Lisa is a civil servant in a medium-sized city dealing with urban development. She has to redesign a congested avenue to improve the quality of life in the neighborhood. It is a hot topic with no straightforward solution and highly conflicting visions. She knows that nowadays a top-down decision runs the risk of being unpopular. However, an agreement that makes everybody happy will be difficult to achieve. She then hears about the Living Lab approach, a new way to address urban problems. Living labs are spaces where multiple actors work towards a shared understanding of a problem and experiment solutions in a real-life context. This approach seems particularly relevant for her case. In a living lab, she could engage all relevant stakeholders, from public administration and politicians to business, academia, and citizens. Together, they could address the many relations between environmental, social, technical, and economic impacts of the project, and find innovative solutions. She wants to try out this new approach. However, experimenting is risky, and living labs do not always work out as intended. Fortunately, she learns about the Smarter Labs guidelines, which help her to avoid common pitfalls, such as results not being used outside the lab or relevant stakeholders being excluded. If, just like Lisa, you are interested in creating a living lab, take a look at the Smarter Labs guidelines. They will help to set up a successful living lab.
Okay, well, I particularly like the artwork. In terms of content, you don't learn that much, but okay, sorry. Yep. Anyway, the Smarter Lab guidelines are available in the internet. I also brought a small version with me for you to see. So what it basically is that we identified major constraints to upscaling, including risk of social exclusion, and how to anticipate those in the design of your experiments and your urban living lab. The guidelines and the small version on how to anticipate those constraints. So these were, again, generating both scientific insights as well as very practical tools on how to address constraints. Another project addressing upscaling is the Learn to Transition project, where we try to promote upscaling by actively influencing regime conditions, by including important strategic regime actors in the experimenting and learning phase. So think about legislators, people in charge of large companies that do technological developments that are important, etc. So it is applied to a project super local called where in restructuring, renovating a neighborhood, it is attempted to make this neighborhood completely circular in terms of energy, water, etc. And the Learn to Transition project focuses particularly on a closed water cycle. And by including important actors in the current water regime in the learning and experimentation phase, we hope to already change sort of the mindset of those actors, and in that way prepare the grounds for upscaling of the innovations and regime transition. So it's done by integrating not only an assessment of the innovations that are taking place, but to connect this assessment with both users, citizens, etc., as higher level actors from legislation, government, technology, industry, etc. Then another very important project is, of course, the Glocal project, globally and locally sustainable food, water, energy innovation in urban living labs, which is part of a larger international program, SUGI, Sustainable Urbanization Global Initiative on the Food, Water, Energy Nexus, where we have 7 urban living labs, 4 in Europe and 3 outside Europe, 1 in Sao Paulo. And Gabriella can tell you much more about it. So I'll talk more about what Glocal wants to address in terms of upscaling. Here, the relationship with upscaling is that we try to avoid the development of local innovations that turn out to be unsustainable when being scaled up, and in that way experiencing constraints to being scaled up. So to ensure already in the local development phase of an innovation that it's also globally sustainable, you sort of also promote and facilitates the upscaling of this local innovation to a much wider implementation. And again, it's type of action research. So it's done by doing interventions, by developing innovations on the ground in urban living labs, and at the same time developing these tools to assess the sustainability, also the global sustainability of these innovations by using assessment tools that can be used by the actors in the urban living lab. Then the last project, and then I'm almost finished, is a project that just started a month ago. It's a national project, but still quite large. It involves all major cities in the Netherlands. It's called SIMALab, Smart Urban Mobility Meta Lab. So what we do there is to try to promote upscaling by connecting local urban living labs on mobility. So in all major cities in the Netherlands, a lot of mobility experiments are going on to make the mobility more sustainable in the city, the mobility systems. But they're isolated, the learning is isolated, and what we're doing is try to connect them, have a shared learning agenda at national level, and then bring the lessons together and disseminate the lessons again from well, let's say the overarching level back to the cities. Okay, so to summarize, I've listed here a couple of challenges, and associated with these challenges a couple of pitfalls in upscaling solutions from urban living labs. In the Smarter Lab projects, we learned that anticipation of constraints to upscaling is difficult. So it's easier, what you often see happening is that it's easier to optimize for a niche application. So people develop a sustainable innovation, but then forget about the need to scale it up. They sort of optimize it, and so it remains in the niche where it was developed. So you often see that with a lot of sustainability innovations, they remain niche innovations for a niche audience. In the Learn to Transition project, we already learned that involving these strategic actors in broad sustainability learning is quite difficult. And because it's rather difficult, there's a strong tendency to focus only on the technological experts with a group of experts. In the Glocal project, we already learned that interesting local stakeholders for global impacts is also quite difficult. So it's easier and you see the tendency to focus on a local solution for a local problem and forget about the need for wider implementation to reach a sustainability transition. Also in the Summerlab project, after a year of preparation, we already learned that pursuing a shared interlocal learning agenda, so more formulated at the national level, is quite difficult. So you see a very strong tendency to focus on local lessons that are relevant to the very specific local conditions. So conclusions on upscaling are that basically it's interesting to see that the strength of urban living labs in terms of being locally embedded, being very oriented to solving concrete problems, having this participatory approach involving a lot of different stakeholders, including citizens, at the same time can pose barriers to upscaling the solutions that are developed in the urban living labs. Yeah, so that's quite a intrinsic tension to urban living labs because of their local focus, creating barriers for scaling up beyond local. And that's why the second conclusion is that to make upscaling from urban living labs happening at a wider scale and more frequently and more successfully, there's a need for targeted support by tools that support upscaling and tools that are co-created by the people and the workers in the urban living lab. Okay. Here I am. Yeah. Thank you.
Perfect, Yup. 40 minutes. Great. You did very well. Thank you so much for your presentation and for bringing us some ideas about urban living labbing, sharing with us some results and challenges involved in our research, in our studies. And now I would like to hear Professor Pedro Jacob talking about the challenges and opportunities when we're thinking about urban living lab, transdisciplinary action research in the Brazilian context, especially when we're thinking about that dialogue, transparency, trust, participation, engagement are the basis for this kind of approach. It's a big challenge for you, Pedro, but again, thank you so much.
Thank you, Yup. I'm overwhelmed because I think our realities are really very, very different. No? At the same time, well, if I talk a little bit about my personal experience and engagement, somehow these activities that we are developing are very autonomous. I think that makes a big difference. But at the same time, I feel pretty comfortable listening to you because I'm the president of the board of ICLEI South America. And when I look at the agenda of ICLEI, global agenda of ICLEI, the issues are low emission, nature-based solutions, equitable initiatives, resilient cities, and circular development. So they're totally combined with the agenda that you presented for us now. So I mean that these agendas are presented globally, but obviously we're always dealing, like talking yesterday with the executive secretary of ICLEI, we had a meeting in Santos talking about capacity building on resilient issues and urban low emission strategies. We're always talking about very small cases that we consider relevant, and at the same time we have to we need the support of local governments. I consider there is one basic difference that makes it look so different between our realities and the European realities. That are the European directives. Somehow the European directive engage governments and local governments to agendas that have to be accomplished. And this implies in different type of policies. I consider that these are aspects that we cannot deny. We don't have directives. And actually we are in a moment where the directives are being not downscaled. The directives are being reduced practically. Some of the directives, they're being dehydrated. No, we're losing some real important gains that we'd had in national policies and public policies. But definitely, I think that, and we have been working together with Professor Leandro Giatti on the issue of the urban nexus. And it was a very autonomous initiative, no? Trying to dialogue with municipalities and at the same time provoking the municipalities to engage in certain types of agendas or labs, if we want to call them. We tried, no? We did our best. And at the same time, the projects, they have a very short timing, and that makes it that you're not able really to follow how much of the initiative created resilience, created some type of involvement and continuity. I think that is important because definitely when we talk about transitions and sustainable transitions, we have some local governments that could be more engaged, but the word transitions is very imprecise to most of them. What are we talking about? Transitions towards, no? So basically, I see that we need to be stronger on, stronger, it's not exactly a word, we have to be emphasizing continuously transitions towards decarbonization, for example. Transitions to levels where we really convince municipal governments about the importance of nature-based solutions. These are agendas of ICLEI, for example, no? Nature-based solutions. Agendas towards circular economy, you mentioned. Yeah. I think when you talked about a circular neighborhood, I think it's fantastic. I would love to have the opportunity of a municipality that would consult us in the academy. How would you think about working with a neighborhood and trying to put together some basics of circular economy, for example? So in the case of our research project, our macrometropolis, we are divided in several themes, and we basically try to work in a proposition that can be part of a dialogue with public policies. But it doesn't have a specific space. I mean, the space is a macro metropolis, 170 municipalities. The space are different type of possibilities with local governments. But what we're looking is mainly at how to strengthen interdisciplinarity, how to strengthen when we talk about environmental governance, how do we stress the fact that there is a dialogue with ODS, with SDGs, sorry. How do we stress the fact that we're talking about several aspects that are part of the project? Governance, territory, ecosystemic services, energy, and climate. And how do we choose certain areas to do some kind of experiment, but an experiment that is not linked to a demand? It's us who are provoking the kind of demand. So it makes it very different. And this has a lot to do with the logic of financing of projects also. Because when you are involved in international project with the European community, there are some type of specific demands that need to be applied. In our case, it was a very autonomous proposition, engaging a lot of researchers from different moments of their academic life. Seniors as me, in the middle moment of the career, PhDs, masters, postdocs, involved in their agendas, but within a perspective of articulating these agendas of research. And definitely there is a big challenge for us is how to put together climatologists with urban planners, with health people, with sociologists, and educators. So one of the aspects that I am really very motivated is in terms of how do we produce knowledge that can be shared on a perspective of what Leandro and me have been working already for several years on post-normal science, the idea of post-normal science. And at the same time, the ideas of social learning that we have been working also. But as I mentioned, I've been working on social learning with Professor Arjen Wolfs. Okay, I have a PhD who just finished her thesis, and we have published together on these issues. But I want to come back to the aspects of transitions. Where are we moving to? What do our local governments understand about transitions when we have agendas that are dealing basically still with enormous vulnerabilities due to social inequalities? So I'm not saying that I'm against. On the opposite, I really believe that we have to put these pieces together. We have to strengthen decarbonization. This obviously implies, for example, in the need of changing the ways of people's mobilities in our cities. We live in a city, São Paulo, with 11 million inhabitants, metropolitan area with 22 million inhabitants, macro metropolis with 35 million inhabitants. And our mobility is based on the fact that there is such a retardation of public transportation that people use cars at all levels of incomes, because we are on a very slow pace in terms of really promoting and motivating people to shift from individual transportation to public transportation. So there is a big question mark. Obviously, this has a lot to do with investments. And at the same time of the logic that has been promoted this type of investment. The subway system in São Paulo is from it began in 1975. It began in the same year that in Mexico City. In Mexico City, it has 320 kilometers. São Paulo, less than 100. And that makes it clearly a contradiction in terms of how public, say, policymakers have been dealing with this. So you have been creating some type of alternative, exclusive roads for buses, but very insufficient. And you see that our cities are mostly traffic jammed, no? And people accustomed to it, say, accustomed is not the best word to say, but low-income population, according to the recent research, we call it Origin Destiny, are around 4 or 5 hours a day on transportation. That obviously shortens the daily conviviality of people with their families, etc. Air pollution is mainly in our cities due to uses of cars. Although we have car shift, but it's almost symbolic. So where are our transitions? How do we move towards transitions? Or how do we show that the logic that is prevailing in a city like São Paulo cannot be maintained and at the same time cannot be copied? It's a wrong copy. No? So when we come to solutions based on nature, how much space is given by local governments to propose solutions based on nature when the urbanization is so irregular and where the investments of real estate is so violent that it makes very easy to lose the possibilities of having greener spaces. So we have contradictions. Where are we moving towards kind of transition? In our heads, yes, in our minds, we have a lot of excellent ideas. But in terms of the concrete initiatives, the spaces are much smaller. We're dealing, for example, what are we talking about? Sustainable city. Where are the essential aspects of a sustainable city? How can we promote innovation? There are small neighborhood initiatives, but they are basically autonomous. Sometimes they are co-opted by municipalities. You have some interesting cases. In São Paulo, there are some cases interesting. Rediscovering the rivers. Where are the rivers? We find them, no? At the same time, we have to struggle that the river doesn't disappear because there's a high-rise building on top of it, no? So the issue of cycling or using more bicycles. This brings up another aspect, the discontinuity of local governments. You propose in a government to multiply the number of spaces for cycling, although it's not an easy city to cycle. Now, there are some parts, here we are okay to cycle, but there are neighborhoods like mine where it becomes a little more complicated because of the slopes and all that. But I mean, there was a municipal government that put a lot of stress on the use of bicycles, and the other one begins to deconstruct. So that's the question: is how to promote transitions where you have such a contradiction in terms of the political culture of non-continuity. It's a big question for us. We have to talk about it because we cannot just be naive and say, oh, we want transitions, no? So definitely when we try to think about a problem-oriented innovation and the idea of co-creation, we're full of good ideas, but not necessarily they are assimilated by local governments. You may have some of them, but you can count them, unfortunately. No, so but that doesn't bring me frustration. It brings me mostly the need to show that we have to have an agenda. Globally, there is an agenda of SDGs, but we know SDGs, it's a kind of threshold which will not be reached. But it is a threshold that is a provocation. And some local governments will take it more seriously, and others will make a kind of what we call greenwashing, local government greenwashing. But definitely there are examples. And when we see that organizations like ICLEI have an assimilation in local governments, that there is a political will to promote. So I consider that the work that you are doing very relevant, because we have to promote initiative, we have to promote exemplarities, we have to promote guidelines, we have to promote upscaling. All this has to be done. And sometimes you can do it with more support of local governments, and other times you have to do it as a kind of, what could I say the word, of the clear conviction that is necessary to change the logic that has been prevailing, because the logic that has been prevailing is very predatory to human life, to the human quality of life. So human, innovation mentality has been showing at the agenda that you have been putting together that there are possible initiatives, but obviously they have to have the support of governments. No? You can do it that way when you have in a small group, a small community you create, like you had in Denmark, in Copenhagen. No? Even that doesn't work as well as they proposed. But anyhow, to consider the idea that there is a need to multiply ideas, that we are here in a space where we are free to talk. Some people may say that we are absolute utopians. But definitely, I believe that bringing up a discussion of transitions is essentially about engaging more and more multipliers of an agenda that has to be developed through research, that has to be developed through an understanding of the need to rethink governance, of the need of interdisciplinarity, strengthening intersectoriality. What we have in our local government in general is feuds of interests that are not really dialoguing in terms of an intersectorial engagement. Say, let's look at solid waste, for example. All the approaches have been already discussed. Here in a city like São Paulo, in Brazil, there's still an enormous engagement of waste pickers. But waste pickers is something that you could say, well, it's a little outdated. But definitely when you have a lot of unemployment, people, it's one possibility of working not only in Brazil, in South America, in Africa. Huh? And obviously they have a contradiction between some countries where they say, well, the solution for solid waste is incinerators. But if we don't want incinerators, what do we have to propose when we look at transitions of cities? Diminish the production of solid waste. Promote more and more selective collection and recycling and circular economy from cradle to cradle type of ideologies. But there we have a big barrier that are the contracts in the large cities, for example, with enormous holdings that take care of 11,000 tons day of waste in a city like São Paulo. So there you begin to see, and at the same time that the waste travels almost 60, 70 kilometers to waste deposits. But obviously we can think that these transitions begin to indicate that there has to be different type of processes for us to dialogue. So I'm bringing up issues for us to think. Water. People always imagined that water was sufficient in a metropolis like São Paulo. But with the crisis that we had in 2014-15, it indicated that we have very serious problems, that the new normal is water scarcity. And how do you deal with a situation of water scarcity where the public company, although public, 51% public and 49% private, is worried about selling water? And then you have shareholders who are looking for the profits of this. And at the same time, bringing up the fact that the water is distributed. In São Paulo, it's not as bad in other regions in terms of the population that doesn't have the best access to water. It's related also to topography, to irregular settlements. But the big problem is sewage. And we have still an enormous problem of sewage treatment and the contamination of our waterways. So, where is the transition there? The transition is only through large investments or through different type of solutions that are much more people-oriented than profit-oriented, say. So when we begin to talk about this thing, about these issues, we begin to realize how many barriers that we would like not to have really exist. How much vested interests are also against thinking transition. No? So I really considered, say, when you spoke about Antwerp, Experiment the Future, 5 Themes, 2050, no? And that was a little bit like the agenda that you mentioned about ICLEI, because at the end, our creativity has limits. No? But definitely, some issues are interesting to see. Giving space to the river, that's an agenda that is strong in Holland. No? Our rivers, if you ask people, would you like to see, how do you like to see the river? Here we have a river when you enter the USP. And I did a research already 10 years ago, a little bit more even, and we asked the people, well, how would you like to see the river 10 years from now? That was in 2004, 2005. And they said covered. So this shows that for them, because, why covered? Because there are floods and bad smell. And you can smell it here, no, not too far from here. So people's perception is very immediatistic. But at the same time, you can cover the rivers, but they will show their face. we have had some type of engineering solution called piscinoids that are in-depth reservoirs to protect us from floods. But still the number of floods is multiplying because there has been another variable which is important for us to consider in transitions, and it's climate, extreme events, and the problems generated by our fragile drainage systems. This is interesting also because we're looking also, say, our coastal cities. They're all worldwide will be in danger, and all worldwide will need, and as a case of Katrina and Sandy showed, that there is a transition also to be considered, no? So there are so many variables, but definitely, concluding my remarks and then opening for you, Gabriela, to talk a little bit about how you're seeing this kind of upscaling. Because for me, the essential today when we talk academically is to share knowledge. How do we share knowledge? Knowledge where you don't have ethnocentricity, where you don't have Eurocentricity, where you have a real sharing of ideas, then that, as you mentioned, that can be good but can fail. And at the same time, not losing the perception of the need of continuing to promote ideas. To promote ideas that need, on one side, legitimacy, and on the other side, the possibility of certain levels of commitment of local governments, and also of something essential in our society, that is a stronger understanding of being a citizen and co-responsibilities that have to be also put into place. So definitely I consider that initiatives like the one you showed of the Maastricht Sustainable Development is essential. And I consider that in our cases in Brazil, we are on the move. And I think that experiences like we are having now with our projects are on the move to design some kinds of, I don't know if we can speak about smarter labs still, but definitely of articulating more and more researchers into agendas where we strengthen certain themes and certain propositions that, as for example, the case of the nexus, but there can be other types of nexus also. And at the same time, as we deal with such social asymmetries, our logics of nexus can be very different, but they have to do with daily survival of people. So I thank you very much for your provocations. I will look at the slide. In our research project, we are worried about trying to talk more with society. So we are also producing some publications on digital way and trying to strengthen the dialogues on certain issues through digital means, and strengthening also the idea of how to promote more citizen science, what is you were presenting. Thank you very much. I try to do my best, being provoked so much by all these initiatives.
Thank you so much, Pedro, for bringing some ideas to thinking about the Brazilian context and the challenge that we have when we want to put in practice the idea of urban living lab. I'm thinking about that One thing that is very interesting, the Glocal project, which São Paulo is one of the case studies, including this consortium of 7 universities. First of all, I would say that the biggest challenge is, I don't like this word, but I don't have the best verb in my mind, to persuading people to be more connected to us in terms of practitioners, in terms of local stakeholders. So how persuade them, how to convince them that be part of this urban living lab is interesting in terms of producing scientific knowledge, but also to resolve some local problems, urgent problems. So, and one thing that I really enjoy in the Glocal project is the 3 different levels of analysis that we have in terms of context, in terms of urban living lab, and in terms of the experiment. Yeah, because when we're thinking about the context, thinking about São Paulo seat, we have to think about environmental, social, cultural, economic, and political, technical, legal, organizational aspects that influence how São Paulo deal with sustainability, how São Paulo deal with environment, social environmental dynamics and problems. So I think that when we map this general profile, this context, it's helpful to understand why there are some conditions that facilitate to go further, and some barriers and that are constraints that make things so difficult. And the second level is building this urban living lab. So we are always asking who participates in the urban living lab. Yeah, how researchers, practitioners, local stakeholders interact with each other, how they trust with each other, how they want to produce new knowledge in terms of co-production, in terms of collaboration, how we can negotiate different goals, different objectives, what are our motivations to participate. And in terms of experiment, the third level of the Glocal project, I would say that, as we said yesterday during our interaction at School of Public Health, we are trying to better understand what's going on in the south zone of São Paulo in terms of improve the conditions for local agriculture, improve the conditions of the farmers, keeping the farmers in that area. And this is a way to avoid the urban sprawl, is the way to protect the biodiversity. But again, when you see that for the practitioners, there are so many difficulties to go further, so many difficulties to put into practice their ideas. So I think that our main contribution is to identify why so hard, why so difficult, how can we get easier this kind of transition, you know?
Exactly, and you were mentioning the case of the south, the region of, say, of Parelheiros.
Yes, yes.
So there were moments of the municipal government was very open and stimulating this type of initiatives at that region. And I know farmers that have been working there together through programs that were financed or supported by the municipality, mainly by the fund, environmental fund of the municipality. And that was a big growth expansion of these activities, and now they are more autonomous and have been consolidating. So it's a good experience, it's a very interesting experience, but it has to do somehow with the support of the local governments, so these type of organizations flourish. And also the commitment of these farmers that are mostly middle class, and that they are doing pretty well. That's also interesting because they are somehow promoters of a culture of more consumption on organics. No? And this has been growing in the city of São Paulo. This you can really see how much there has been growing. So when you were saying this, public policy has to be supportive. Otherwise, if people have the initiative on their own, great. But mostly this has been very relevant in terms of creating small markets in the region where people can buy the products, or they are into some kind of cooperative or thing like that. No? Sorry.
Yeah. But anyway, I would like to open for the public for questions for you or Pedro Jacob. Michele.
Hi, I'm Michele Della Fontana from Public Health Faculty at the USP. Thank you for both of the presentations, but I have two questions for you. So based on your experience, I would like to know who is, in the Urban Living Labs, who is defining what is innovation and how you do that, and how do you deal with risk-taking? Because I think that depending on the actors that is involved, different actors can take different risks. And for example, I don't see many risks for scholars participating at the Urban Living Lab. On the other side, there are many risks for municipality or civil society also. So how do you deal with that, if you deal with that in the Urban Living Labs?
Okay, thank you, Michele. It's a very good point.
Can I have another question?
Yeah, so I note down the issue from Michele. Yeah.
Ok. Depois você quer deixar o microfone aqui, lá? Você pode sentar. Okay. Thank you both for the presentations. Thank you for your nice insights and proposals. So if I had a good understanding on urban living labs, so the idea is to co-create solutions, right? To put together different social actors with different interests and positions, and so. But of course, I can understand that this idea, this need for upscaling good experiences. But in this sense, I'm trying to understand that you can have this kind of creation in a small scale, like an experiment, and then if it's good, you have this challenge of making it like a mainstream alternative, and it will be supposedly legitimated by the interaction of different social actors and so on. But I would like to make a reflection on the perspective of upscaling from the perspective of our deep inequalities. I suppose you know Brazilian or African inequalities because you told about a previous experience. So anyway, we have studied the nexus, for example, in a small community in Guarulhos, which is a municipality in the metropolitan region of São Paulo. So in the poor community, in the conditions of social environmental vulnerability, people are constantly creating alternatives. It was interesting for us to understand. In the sense of the nexus, sometimes the creation of the community were good to the nexus, like representing synergies. So we could learn with the communities, with their capacity to create. But sometimes the same possibility of creation are making trouble, like exacerbating the trade-offs among the nexus. So, but otherwise, we would like to see a positive interaction from the public policies in an upper scale to understand the local dynamics and making positive interactions. So maybe in this sense, In this sense, the communitarian solutions will not be the solution for upscaling. It will be necessary to make new pathways for interaction or creating public policy to make this possible upscaling. But of course, there is a huge rupture in the society because the matter of social exclusion is not about material inclusion, like income, like literacy or other relevant things. Also, the exclusion is a matter of cognitive exclusion. The way that people create and understand the world is not considered by the hegemonic knowledge of public policy or policymakers or even by academics. So how to think about upscaling in the sense of dealing with this capacity of creation from the communities, from the poor communities, but considering this kind of rupture. That's it. My name is Leandro. I presented myself from the School of Public Health. Okay, thank you.
Maybe I first respond to Michele and Leandro.
Please.
Otherwise I forget. Well, both are very good issues. I mean, and there are also no easy solutions to it. If it would be a miracle. These are long-standing issues, and we try to address those in urban living labs, but we still have to learn how to do it, and depending also on the conditions. For example, the risk-taking is a very crucial one, because the whole idea about an urban living lab is that you experiment and learn. So that implies, and it's also been often a kind of key phrase, we need room for failure. Otherwise, you cannot learn, you cannot experiment. If everything has to be successful, it's not an experiment. And as scientists, we're used to that. We don't like it, and it's hard to publish failed experiments, but it's part of the deal. We're used to that. You always learn something, I say to the students. So, but the interesting thing is that also at least in Europe, so the urban living lab often is initiated by municipality, by civil servants. But it's not part of their normal routine to take risks and to fail and learn from it. Usually they're punished for it. So it's quite interesting to see this dynamic. Also involved myself as a participant in an urban lab in the city where I used to live for many years. And then at the very beginning, when it started, the aldermen say, "Yeah, okay, we have to learn, and it's wonderful." But very quickly you see that this room for failure disappears. Once it's established, basically it has to become a success, because the alderman, he's been in the newspaper at the start, so he also wants to be again in the newspaper showing the successes, not the failures. So it's very important from the start to make clear and to manage expectations that everything is not going to be a success, and that the learning is the success, and not very concrete achievements. And the learning can also help in avoiding costs in the future, etc. So that has to really be an issue to pay a lot of attention to. Constantly to manage these expectations, to avoid people from sort of hijacking the lab and saying, okay, it's a success, and well, this is what the lab achieved, etc., where it has nothing to do with the lab. So it's a good point. But it's sort of continuous struggle, and it's also requires that time and again you have to remind the other partners that we're here to learn. and it's the lessons that are the most important contribution from the lab, rather than very concrete successes. Okay, then the other issue about the sort of, from Leandro, the conflicts of interests also, and the different position probably that local governments have vis-a-vis citizens as compared to Europe also, and that point was also brought up by my colleague here. In the Netherlands, I think we're usually in a quite luxury position, that you have indeed those European directives, you have these policy goals, and you have local governments very seriously trying to achieve these policy goals. And in that way, be usually very happy with us if we step out of our ivory tower and say, hey, can we help you? Can we contribute to you? Rather than focusing on our research alone. But interestingly, in the Smarter Labs project, we had one of our partner cities, or universities rather, was Brussels, Free University of Brussels. And interestingly, whereas Brussels is the capital of Europe in a way, it's in terms of local government, it's a very different situation than we're experienced to in Netherlands, but also in Antwerp. The local government of Brussels actually is very weak and very politicized and very has a very antagonistic relationship with the inhabitants, with the citizens. So they also were not involved in the Living Lab as a partner because they were not interested, etc. So our main partner there was an environmental NGO, which had a very antagonistic relationship with the Brussels local government. So instead of teaming up with the local government, the Living Lab was more sort of provoking the local government. And what they did was they followed a much more political, activist type of approach there. For us from Netherlands was, hey, what you're doing? We collaborate with local government. No, we don't. At least not from the beginning. So what they did was to basically to attract the attention and the willingness to collaborate from the local government by making it a very political issue. So it was about sustainable mobility, but they emphasized the issue of air quality and of health. And in that way, they were able to mobilize the school parents. So they focused on the issue of air quality around schools, and they were able to make the parents worry about this, and make the parents start actions, closing down, blocking roads in front of schools because of the air quality and the health of the children. And that attracted the attention of the politicians because they started those actions during the period of upcoming elections. And then the local politicians started to appear in the street and wanting to be part of the movement and say, yeah, we support the mothers and the fathers, and we also want health around the schools. So in that way, by taking this road, they were able to engage actually the local governments and the politicians to put it on the agendas. So sometimes you have to take a more activist type of approach, more politicizing the issue rather than sort of harmoniously collaborating with local governments, as is something we can usually do in the Netherlands. So that's also to address the point of Leandro in the situations of high inequality. of local governments not being so interested in the problems that these groups experience. Perhaps elections, politicizing the issue, maybe a road there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Thank you, Yup. It's a good strategy for us. Do you hear me? No. It's a good strategy for us in terms of our urban living lab in São Paulo. Provoke people, provoke local government to convince them that social environmental issues are important, and also remember then that the learning is the success. Yeah, so I think that is good advice for our case. Yeah. Any questions? No?
Michele spoke about the risks. Trying to think a little bit about the type of risks that we can have in a project like the one I am engaged is, we would say, is basically academic, no? Essentially, because it is an autonomous initiative. Obviously, the funders can be critical about our outcomes and what we propose as outcomes. But definitely, I consider that we have to take some risks in our project. It's a 5-year project, and we have still 2 years and a half, that we have to create some kind of interactive spaces or arenas where we open certain types of dialogues, and there can be the risks of not understanding the proposal, and at the same time the risk of being a little visionaries in terms of the constraints that the reality indicates. No? And I would like to stress a little bit more. I would like to ask you to elaborate a little bit more about which are the main indicators of transitions that can be thought in terms of people's mindsets and local governments' understanding of improving their dynamics of governance in terms of sustainability. No? Because the agendas exist. The issue is how to put them into practice, and at the same time how to confront, in many cases, the vested interest. Why is a local government not interested when you have these directives that indicate the need of certain types of modifications of the business as usual logic?
And also, considering your experience in Latin America, it would be nice to hear you.
Yeah, well, I think, it was also mentioned that if people have to struggle to survive, you should not tell them about, livability in 100 or 200 years from now, when they have trouble in surviving till the next day. So I think these daily and more immediate concerns always should be taken very seriously. So I've never taken a very utopian position there, because I feel it's like not taking. Of course, it's important to think about how do we survive in 200 and 400 or 500 years from now. but that should not prevent people to survive till the next day. So taking those very seriously, I think that's already the first step in sustainable development. But the vested interests, the power relations, that's all something that actually, as a scientist, we cannot do so much about. So there's a role for activists. There's a role for political parties. There's a role for citizen movements, etc. As a scientist, I can basically only try to support those initiatives and those tools, and that's my sort of moral responsibility as a scientist, what I choose to support. But as a citizen, perhaps I also take upon other roles. I'm a member of an environmentalist movement, etc. But as a scientist, I try to say, okay, what in terms of knowledge, what in terms of support tools do you need that I can provide you? That's why also in the Netherlands we're always looking for initiatives started by people, citizens, local governments, companies, etc., that we can sort of associate with and support. And so it's not that we think, okay, this is the direction society has to go, this is the transition that it needs, and now I try to engage other people to join, and usually, hey, they're not interested. How come? We try to work the other way around. We try to see, okay, where is there a need? Where can we contribute? And then try to make that contribution together with the others. I said it also excludes the problem of, nobody wants to engage with us. But it creates risks also in terms of career as a scientist, because usually you're forced to deal with very practical issues. It doesn't help on very high-level theory development, but fortunately in our institute with our director, that's supported, and it's still possible to get funding that way. You have to find the right funders that are willing to fund this. In terms of number of high-ranking publications, it's not the most productive area. But it has been productive in other ways in terms of being able to co-create tools that are found to be useful by practitioners. That's something I value myself quite a lot, and fortunately is also valued by my university.
I also have another question, Joep, in terms of funding, because, for example, in our case, it's quite hard to get funding from the City Hall, for example, in our urban living lab. So our funding is from São Paulo Research Foundation, who funds our research. In your experience, Urban Living Lab is more successful when we have a combination of different fundings, and also when you engage politicians, not only practitioners or civil servants and local stakeholders in the process?
In our situation in the Netherlands, it's hard to get funding from municipality or province or so, because they have very strong idea. Well, this is public money, taxpayers' money. It should not go to research. And there are other mechanisms for research. But they are willing and interested to set up an urban living lab, and so we associate with them, and then find funding from other sources for ourselves, but not for the activity in the lab. It's a bit different for situation in Belgium. There they have also more local funds for research when it's applied. For example, we have this project with the city of Antwerp to develop a learning support tool for the Urban Living Lab in Antwerp. Substantial money, which in Netherlands would not be possible. They would never do it. So it also depends where you are quite a lot. But we're all already happy, I mean, in terms of that, for example, Maastricht and other city Heerlen, they provide substantial funds for, well, setting up living labs. And we participate in that with our own funds.
In terms of the engagement of politicians?
Yeah, of course, that's very important. So you don't get these funds, you don't get them to set up these living labs when the politicians do not fund you. Well, fortunately, the politicians like it because it shows, well, they work with the citizens, they take the citizens seriously by involving them in these labs. The danger, of course, is that they want to see successes, that they can come in the newspapers and the local TV, etc., saying, okay, we started this living lab and look here. So it's important also to look for things that can be portrayed as a success for politicians. So you cannot be simply a pure scientist. You also have to take care of these things and public relations and expectation management, framing of issues. Yeah.
Some questions?
No.
So, thank you again, Yup and Pedro, for your participation in this debate about Urban Living Lab and the possibilities, challenges, and opportunities especially for us in the case of Brazil and São Paulo. Thanks for the public for the attention. And it's nice to have you. Thank you.
Thank you, Dirk.